room smelled like stale coffee and old ambition. I'd been in boardrooms like this one before, the kind where the chairs cost more than my first car and the people sitting in them never let you forget it. Colonel Hargrove was already laughing before I finished my sentence. Not a polite laugh, not the kind you use to fill silence. A full, open-mouthed laugh that made the junior officers around the table shift in their seats. He looked at the man to his left, some contractor from Vancouver I'd never met, and shook his head like I'd just told a joke about penguins. "What's your designation, sweetheart?" The word landed like a slap. I felt it across my jaw, my collarbone, somewhere behind my sternum. 12 years of service, 2 tours, a classified op that I still couldn't name in public. And I was sweetheart. I stood ramrod straight. I have always been good at standing straight. "Iron Meridian," I said. The laugh stopped. I mean, it stopped completely, the way sound stops when a window breaks. The contractor froze mid-reach for his water glass. The junior officer at the far end of the table looked down at his folder like something in it had suddenly become very interesting. And Colonel Hargrove, this man who had walked into the room like he already owned every outcome, went still in a way I had not seen a military man go still since the day my commanding officer received news that 3 of our people weren't coming home. He knew exactly who I was. I should back up. My name is Petra, and the Canadian Armed Forces were not supposed to be my life. I grew up in Sudbury, in a house where the winters came early and stayed long, and where my father drove a mining supply truck and my mother taught grade 4 at the French immersion school 2 blocks from our house. Neither of them had ever worn a uniform. Neither of them pushed me toward one. I joined at 22 because I'd spent 4 years at Laurentian studying aerospace engineering and finished with a degree, $40,000 in debt, and a job offer in Mississauga that would have paid me to sit in a cubicle checking numbers someone else had already checked. The recruiter at the CFB North Bay information session made it sound like I could do both, the engineering and the sky, and I was young enough to believe that things worked out for people who were willing. For the most part, things did. I was good at the work. Not in the way people say that to be polite. I mean, I was genuinely, structurally good at it. The kind of good that gets noticed even when people don't want to notice it. I earned my wings at Moose Jaw and cross-trained into intelligence systems analysis, which is a very long way of saying I spent a lot of time in rooms where I was not supposed to understand what was being said, and I understood all of it. By 30, I had done things I am still not allowed to describe in detail. I had a designation, Iron Meridian, assigned after an op in an Allied theater that resulted in 3 pieces of intelligence, so specific, so actionable, that a general I never met apparently printed one of the reports and kept it framed on his office wall. I know this because someone told me years later at a retirement dinner the way military people tell stories, sideways, half smiling, like even the good ones cost something. I had also, somewhere in those years, become a woman who made colonels uncomfortable. Not intentionally, or maybe intentionally, I was never very good at performing smallness. The assignment to the Ridgeline project came in the spring, about 8 months before I walked into that boardroom. Ridgeline was a Joint Forces Air Defense Initiative, Canadian, partly funded through a NATO technical cooperation agreement, and it was supposed to be the most sophisticated distributed radar architecture this country had ever deployed. The project lead was a man named Forsyth. I never called him by his first name and he never offered it. Forsyth was the kind of man who had been combatant at one point in his career and had spent the 15 years since then protecting that reputation instead of building a new one. He had opinions about women in technical roles that he expressed through an elaborate system of small discouragements, the extra documentation he required for my submissions, the way he summarized my ideas in meetings before I'd finished presenting them, the time he introduced me to a visiting delegation from the RCAF as one of our support staff. I said nothing. I documented everything. There was a second person I need to tell you about, a man I'll call the contractor. His name was Sebastian, and he worked for a defense technology firm based in Calgary that had a subcontract on Ridgeline software architecture. Sebastian was charming in the way that some men are charming, completely and without cost, because charm like that never comes out of their own pocket. He called me by my first name from the first day we met. He brought the right coffee to the right meetings. He laughed at Forsyth's jokes just long enough and stopped just before it became embarrassing. I noticed, early on, that Sebastian's access to certain system schematics exceeded what his contract scope required. I flagged it through the proper internal channel. Nothing happened. I flagged it again 6 weeks later with a written summary. The summary was acknowledged and filed. 3 months after that, a portion of Ridgeline's frequency hopping algorithm appeared in a technical paper published by a research institute with known ties to a foreign intelligence service. The paper cited open-source modeling. The algorithm was not open source. I was one of 5 people who had access to the original file. I know, because I had been watching the file. Because I'd been watching Sebastian for months by then, quietly, the way I had learned to watch things, in my peripheral vision, through access logs, through the tiny inconsistencies that people who are moving carefully still leave behind. I compiled what I had and brought it to Forsyth directly. He looked at my report for a long time, then he looked at me. "You're making a serious accusation," he said. "Yes," I said. "I know. Sebastian has been with this project from the beginning. His firm has a relationship with this department going back 15 years. I understand that." He set the report down on his desk in a way that felt very final. "I think you may be misreading some of the data here," he said. "These log discrepancies can have a dozen explanations." I sat with that for a second. "Will you escalate it?" I asked. "I'll review it," he said. He did not escalate it. What happened next took about 6 weeks, and I have gone over it so many times in my mind that it no longer feels like memory. It feels like a film I've watched too often, where I know every cut, every beat, every moment before it arrives. Forsyth called me into his office on a Tuesday morning. He told me there had been a security review, an internal one, initiated by his office, and that there were concerns about my own access patterns. He told me I was being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. He told me this calmly, with a coffee mug in his hand, in a tone that suggested this was a procedural matter and not the thing it actually was. The thing it actually was, I was being set up to take the fall for what Sebastian had done. I went home to my apartment in Ottawa, a 1-bedroom near the Rideau River that I had never gotten around to properly furnishing, and I sat at my kitchen table and I did not cry. I want to be honest about that. I didn't cry because I wasn't surprised, not all the way down. I had known, somewhere underneath everything, that this was one of the ways this could go. That knowing didn't make it smaller, it made it lonelier. I called my mother. I didn't tell her the specifics, she worried about me enough already, and she had a bad heart and a grade 4 class that needed her full attention. But I told her I was going through something difficult at work. "Come home for the weekend," she said. "I'll make tortillas." "I'm okay," I said. "I know you're okay. I'm making tortillas anyway." I went home for the weekend. My father and I drove out to Kiwi Park on the Saturday and walked the trails for 2 hours without talking much, which is the kind of relationship we have. And it was exactly what I needed. When we got back to the car, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You're tougher than whatever this is." I believed him. Not because I had to, but because he's never said anything like that to me unless it was true. On the drive back to Ottawa on Sunday evening, I made 2 decisions. The first was that I was going to fight this. The second was that I was not going to fight it the way they expected me to. Loudly, reactively, in a way that could be framed as unstable or emotional, or a woman who couldn't handle pressure. I was going to fight it the way I had learned to fight everything, quietly, completely, and from a position of overwhelming preparation. I'd kept copies of everything. This is something I want people to understand about the kind of work I had spent 12 years doing. You develop habits, redundancy habits, documentation habits, the habit of assuming that the official record may not be the complete record and that you are responsible for maintaining your own. I had access logs going back 8 months. I had timestamped emails. I had the original flag reports I had submitted through internal channels with the read receipts attached. I had, in a very deliberate and careful move I had made 3 months earlier, preserved a forensic snapshot of the Ridgeline file access history on a personally encrypted drive that was sitting in a fireproof lockbox in my Ottawa apartment. I reached out to a colleague. someone I had met during a joint training exercise in Cold Lake years before, who now worked in a completely different part of the department. And I asked her if she knew anyone I could trust. She gave me a name and a phone number and told me not to email about it. The person at the end of that phone number turned out to be a retired RCMP officer who had spent the last decade doing exactly the kind of work I needed, extracting clean, documented, legally presentable evidence from situations where the people responsible for producing that evidence had a conflict of interest. She was methodical in a way that reminded me of my best instructors. She was also extremely expensive, and I paid her with the entirety of my savings account and zero regret. Over the next 10 weeks, while I was technically on administrative leave, we built a file. I won't go through every detail of what we found, partly because some of it is still subject to confidentiality agreements, and partly because the mechanics are less important than the outcome. What I will say is that Sebastian had not been working alone. The frequency hopping algorithm was not the first thing to leave the project, and Forsyth, I still have trouble saying this plainly, even now, Forsyth had known. Not everything, but enough. He had known enough, and had done nothing because Sebastian's firm had a contract renewal coming, and Forsyth was hoping to transition into a private advisory role with that same firm within 18 months of the project completion. He had been going to let me carry it. We submitted the file to the department's Inspector General office and, separately, to a contact at the RCAF who had the authority and the inclination to make sure it didn't disappear into the same channel as my original flag reports. We also submitted it to a journalist at the Globe and Mail who covered defense procurement, with a clear understanding of what could be published and when. Then I waited. Waiting is the hardest part of everything. I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because the active phase of fighting something at least gives you somewhere to put your energy. Waiting is just you and the thing you're afraid of, alone in a room together, with nothing to do but notice how afraid you actually are. I went back to Sudbury for 2 weeks. I helped my father recalk the windows before the frost came. I made toddy out of my mother twice and let her win at Scrabble on purpose, though she is genuinely better at it than me. My younger sister, she lives in Barrie now with her husband and 2 kids, drove up for a weekend, and we stayed up too late talking about nothing important, and I felt, for the first time in months, like a person and not a file in a pending investigation. The review process took longer than I expected and shorter than I feared. The Inspector General's findings were not made fully public. They rarely are, but I was told, through my contact, that what the office had uncovered was described internally as a significant failure of oversight and a pattern of conduct inconsistent with the department's security obligations. Sebastian's firm lost its contract. Sebastian himself faced a federal investigation that I believe is still ongoing. Forsyth retired, quietly, 6 weeks before his planned date, and the advisory position with the Calgary firm was withdrawn. I was reinstated. Not with an apology. The department is not really in the business of apologies, and I was not really in the business of waiting for one. But with a full clearance restoration, a formal acknowledgement that my original flag reports had been improperly handled, and an assignment to a new position that was, in practical terms, a significant step up from where I'd been. The meeting in that boardroom, the one where Colonel Hargrove laughed, happened 3 months after my reinstatement. I was there as a technical advisor for the successor initiative to Ridgeline. A new project, a new room, but the same kind of men, doing the same kind of math about who was worth listening to and who wasn't. When he asked me for my designation and laughed, I think he expected me to flinch, or to smile carefully, the way women in rooms like that learn to smile, or to prove myself, to explain, to qualify, to earn the right to be taken seriously in real time, right then, on request, like I had not already spent 12 years doing exactly that. I said, Iron Meridian, and I watched his face change. He knew the name. Of course he knew the name. The work I had done, the intelligence I had produced, the op that couldn't be named, it had moved through the system. The way things move through systems, attaching itself to outcomes, to decisions, to moments that mattered. Iron Meridian was a name that meant something to people at his level, even when they didn't know whose name it was. The contractor to his left leaned forward and said quietly, "Sir, I think you should know." "I know," Colonel Hargrove said. He did not laugh again for the rest of the meeting. What I want to say, and I'm going to say it plainly because I have spent long enough being indirect about things for strategic reasons, is that the point of this story is not revenge. I know the name of this channel. I understand the framing. But what happened to me was not resolved by anything I did to Hargrove in that boardroom. It was resolved by 10 weeks of quiet, meticulous, extremely boring work. By my father recalking windows, by a retired RCMP officer who charged me 4 figures a week and was worth every dollar, by my mother making tortilla and letting me sit at the kitchen table without asking me to be okay yet. The moment in the boardroom was satisfying the way a period at the end of a long sentence is satisfying, not because of what it did, but because of what it meant. That everything I had documented, everything I had preserved, everything I had refused to abandon even when it would have been so much easier to just absorb the damage and move on, all of it had added up to something. To a name. To a room falling silent. To a man who had already decided what I was, forced to reckon with what I actually had been all along. 6 months after that meeting, the Ridgeline Successor Project was formally designated a National Systems Infrastructure Initiative. It was assigned a lead technical advisor. That advisor was me. At the designation ceremony, and yes, there was a ceremony, the armed forces do love a ceremony, a general I had never met shook my hand and said my designation out loud, in a room full of people who knew what it meant. Not sweetheart, not one of our support staff, not the name of whatever placeholder they'd been prepared to assign when they thought someone else was carrying the weight. Iron Meridian. My mother was in the room. She had driven down from Sudbury with my father, who wore his one blazer and looked deeply uncomfortable and deeply proud in exactly the way fathers do. My sister had taken the day off from Barrie. They stood in a row near the back, 3 people from a mining town in northern Ontario, watching their daughter get called by a name that no one was laughing at anymore. I did not cry. But my father did, just a little, which is the only time I have ever seen him cry, and I think that matters more than anything else I've written here. I think about my father standing near the back of that ceremony room, in his one blazer crying quietly while a general said my name out loud. That image is the one I keep coming back to. Not the boardroom, not Hargrove's face going still, not the moment I'd spent 12 years building toward without knowing I was building toward it. Just my father, from Sudbury, who never once told me the world would be fair, only that I was tougher than whatever it put in front of me. He was right, but I want to be honest about what that toughness actually looked like, because I think people sometimes imagine it as something loud, something dramatic, a confrontation, a speech, a moment where you finally say the thing you've been holding back. That's not what saved me. What saved me was documentation. Encrypted drives, a retired RCMP officer I paid with my entire savings account. Tortilla at my mother's kitchen table while I figured out what to do next. There's a version of this story where I fall apart when Forsyth puts that report down on his desk and tells me I'm being placed on leave, where I react the way they expected me to, emotionally, visibly, in a way that would have confirmed every assumption they'd already made about me. I understood in that moment that how I responded was going to matter as much as what I knew. That's not something anyone taught me formally. It's something 12 years of working in rooms where you are underestimated teaches you slowly, without ceremony. What Sebastian did was wrong. What Forsyth allowed to happen was worse, because he had the information and the authority to stop it and chose his own future instead. Those choices had consequences. Real, documented, professional consequences, not because the universe arranged it that way, but because I refused to let the evidence disappear. That's the part I think gets left out of stories like this. Justice doesn't happen to you. You build it, carefully, over weeks and months, in the unglamorous hours when it would be so much easier to absorb the damage and move on. I had to be honest about what I'd seen, even when the easier thing was to stay quiet. That's what I mean when I think about integrity now. Not as a value you declare, but as a series of choices you make when no one is watching and the cost is real. I flagged the access logs twice before anyone listened. I kept copies when I wasn't sure I was allowed to. I reached out through channels that made me uncomfortable because I understood that the official process had already been compromised. And I had to be smart about it, precise. I couldn't afford to be wrong or careless or to let my anger make the file messy. Every time-stamped email mattered, every read receipt, the forensic snapshot I had preserved 3 months before I needed it. That wasn't luck. That was a habit of mine that I'd developed because I'd learned the hard way that the official record is not always the complete one. But none of it would have mattered if I'd given up in the 6 weeks between Forsyth's office and the Inspector General's findings. That stretch, the waiting, the uncertainty, the walks at Kivy Park with my father, the Scrabble games with my mother, that was the part that required something I don't have a clean word for. Not bravery exactly. More like the decision, made quietly and without applause, to keep going when stopping would have been completely understandable. Petra got her name said out loud in a room full of people who understood what it meant. That happened because she documented everything, thought clearly when it would have been easier to react, and refused to quit during the months when no one was watching. Those 3 things, that's the whole story.